Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to part two of eighth house Aquarius Saturn. I'm Kelsey, and this is for those of you who have Saturn in your eighth house and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius. All right, so let's break down the three aspects Aquarius, Saturn, eighth house. So, when thinking about the zodiac sign Aquarius, there are themes of detachment, group dynamics, ideology, and emotional logic. And I know a lot of people, they kind of get triggered when they hear detachment continuously associated with Aquarius, but Capricorn has it too. Both those signs are ruled by Saturn. Okay. There's a little detachment from their emotions. Both signs have water associated with them. So Aquarius, water bearer, Capricorn, sea goat. So the emotions are there, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do something about it. All right. And so next, Saturn. Saturn is associated with restriction, structure, slow growth, earned wisdom. And then you've got the eighth house, which is associated with death, rebirth, power, intimacy, psychological exposure. So if you have Saturn in the eighth house, you might have experienced restriction in power and intimacy. And I can see that that's where Saturn has to get picky. Excuse me. Where Saturn has to be picky. Or why? Because I know I mentioned in part one how Aquarius can be picky at times. And like I mentioned before, it is a necessity at times. So your Saturn return is a journey of earned wisdom. That's what you get. What information can you extract from your experience? Whatever you extract, those are valuable, timeless nuggets. So your Saturn return is about being tested on the themes associated with your Saturn sign. So for me, with an Aquarius Saturn, my Saturn return was about being psychologically tested in group environments, learning who holds power in silence, and what it meant to communicate under emotional pressures. I know that Saturn is moving into the sign of Aries. So, for those of you that with your Saturn return happening under the sign of Aries, you'll more than likely be tested on the themes of learning to take initiative without being impulsive, emotional control and lack of tact when dealing with emotional patterns, calculated courage, and mastering restraint. So, those are just a few themes. You may or may not deal with those directly or indirectly, but they'll probably come up. So let's talk about having Saturn in your eighth house. There are just a few like core themes that I think myself and other eighth house Saturn people might have experienced. The first one is boundaries around energy exchange. Probably experienced via betrayal and power misuse. You've learned about who has access to your power, your stories, your body, your resources. And when you give the wrong people access to the aforementioned, you have to assess why you are trying to prove you're safe by willingly giving up your story or stories, your body, your resources, your power. One thing to be mindful of is when you're overcompensating, it's a sign that you're trying to make up for a lack. Whether that lack is conscious or unconscious, it doesn't matter. Notice this overcompensation for what it is, a performance. You sense that something is missing. So you're trying to fill in the gap. And you might not need to. Second theme, lessons through loss and rebirth. When you have Saturn in the eighth house, you are forced to alchemize pain into power. The process of death and rebirth, aka transformation, it's not glamorous whatsoever. So that's what alchemy is for transforming a gift. Yeah, it's not enough to name the power imbalances that you will experience. It's like, okay, you've named it. What's next? How are you going to rebuild? Now that you know what you know and seen what you've seen, where are you going now? That's why I said in my part 1 video, you cannot rebuild with hate as the source for your growth. Meaning you cannot want to change in spite of. I don't think that can take you very far. Cuz to me it's still it's so codependent because your motivation or your move is predicated on something outside of yourself. Third theme, karmic debts and emotional maturity. The eighth house, as we know, is associated with power and psychological exposure. Saturn in the eighth is clearing or air quote losing personal slash ancestral karma, meaning the loss that you experience with eighth house Saturn could very well be under the guise of clearing personal and or ancestral karmic patterns. So I know for me, the Saturn return, it was really isolating and it was really hard in some aspects. And I think when we're thinking about ancestral karma, if you're having to process that past lineage trauma, if you're having to process that in that present moment, I couldn't imagine being surrounded by people. I don't think there's enough time for you to work through that ancestral karmic pattern if you're still having to keep up certain relationships that do come. You start to judge those relationships in your Saturn return. Can these relationships take me to my next space? Can they come with me to my next space? And that relationship could be to people, it could be to things, anything. And I think that's something to keep in mind when assessing karmic debts from the standpoint of your ancestral karma. So some karmic themes could be related to trust, control, and emotional validation. The rebirth, the rebuilding is your emotional maturity. Like I said in the beginning, Capricorn is known as the sea goat, Aquarius, the water bearer. So the cardinal earth and fixed air know emotions. They understand them very well, very well. But there's this slow build towards sovereignty that I think that you can only really truly acknowledge with emotional maturity. One key thing I think with this particular placement with Saturn being in your eighth house, do not let anyone dominate you. Like that's law. Do not let anyone get you into your personal freedom is not up for debate. Your requirements, your necessities are not up for debate. Like that's not to be gambled with. That's not for somebody to, well, what if I do not settle? Do not get into no power trip. And the fourth theme is deep intimacy. And I think with this placement, you have to really use your energy in your creative work. With Saturn in the eighth, it's easy to want to share with others at times, and it's completely necessary. But with Saturn in the eighth, you'll develop ways to make your energy profitable. So you want to be mindful of rushing to share, because I feel like at some point having Saturn in the eighth, you have to really, I mean, it's shared resources that falls in the eighth house. So you have to be mindful of who you're sharing your resources with. How often are you sharing these resources? Why? So you have to really develop your journey as a Saturn eighth houser. And this is why shadow work should be taken seriously, especially for your Saturn return. Some potential shadow traits of eighth house Saturn is being suspicious of everyone, avoiding intimacy, self-sacrificing for others, attracting psychic vampires until your boundaries sharpen. So throughout your Saturn return, you'll assess the tools you need to incorporate to actively show up in your own life. So instead of being suspicious of everyone, you trust yourself. You trust yourself that you attract. Notice I said attract, align relationships through energetic maturity. You hold honest emotional space for yourself, feeling your feelings, no longer drowning in them in place of avoiding intimacy. You do not have to sacrifice yourself to heal, especially having Saturn in the eighth. I mentioned how you cannot play into power imbalances where you're being dominated in a way that weakens your personal freedom. So you need to model sovereignty rather than self-sacrificing for others. So you can no longer depend on codependent rescuing. Instead of attracting psychic vampires until your boundaries sharpen, your aura embodies all the prerequisites, only those in frequency alignment. So if you have Saturn in the eighth, if you have an Aquarius Saturn, the key takeaway is to save yourself. Not in a negative way, not in a way where you are overpowering others because you're trying to prove that you have to protect yourself. It's not that. You're not protecting yourself. You're not saving yourself from a survival standpoint. You're saving it because you're saving yourself because you can, because you want to, because you need to, up until a certain point. And I think you have to be very mindful of not working through your stuff through your relations with other people. Got to look out for that. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, you can definitely comment. There will be a part 3 final video, so look out for that. Thank you so much for watching. Okay, bye.